As Vera said, I'm a designer. And I also work with front-end, but I'm not a front-end engineer. That is why the title says like as an engineer. So this is my team. This may not be the best picture, but it's the best one that we could take of the team. And there am I in the middle of the group. It's a small group. It's growing a lot this year. And the reason why I chose this topic is because not only does it touch upon all the visual web issues, I also work a lot with SAS and HAML and SASS. So one day I started to code SASS like an engineer. Basically, it all started with the fact that CSS for the web designs available today is no longer enough. If we think of it, most of the CSS rules that we use are rules that were designed to solve the problems typical of the time when they were developed. But now that there's so much responsive design, and it's just not enough. Not only that, it is usually the case that most agents done with CSS are very boring, and preserving them would be a lot copy-paste with a lot of reiterations, and sometimes we are patching things. Basically, it's very difficult to maintain the CSS. It may be unpredictable, and it's usually like a drawer where you throw papers and you know that they're papers that you no longer use, but you still put the papers there because that's what you have. So at a certain time, with all these things that happened with CSS, then SAS came to the rescue. Does anybody here use SAS in your projects? Quite a few people. And does anybody of you, are you very good at SAS? Wonderful, because you won't laugh so much at me then. SAS, when I started using this, was in restoring and restaurando. Initially, it's like love at first sight. A lot of features to use, and you feel like using them all at the same time. But using SAS necessarily leads you, does using it take you to a better CSS? Not necessarily, because in the long run you're writing in a language, and the meta language that will be later on be processed in other, and maybe you get disconnected from the CSS output. So I know a lot about disconnection, because I'm going to tell you some things that are based on true things that happened to me when I first started with SAS. And now I still have to deal with them. Basically, for me, the first thing that I took was the nesting feature. I thought it was the simplest to start. I use HAML, and in Restaurant we use HAML too. And it seemed to me that the syntaxes of SAS, it has two syntaxes. One that looks very much alike like CSS, and the other one that is also similar but via HAML. And when I started, I thought that it was absolutely natural to start the markup of HAML and with SAS, and to have two partials that would be very similar. I thought that that was wonderful. So what happened? At a time, I looked at the inspector, and you see that you have a file of selectors, and if you had to do them in CSS, you wouldn't do them. You are condemning that anchor to specificity. It needs to be in all the previous elements, and that's not a good thing. On top of that, the more you nestle, the longer it takes to compile. So apparently this would be very good, but you have to be very careful as to how to use it. The SAS community produced the inception rule that it means that you shouldn't nest more than 4 levels deep. My advice is to nest as little as possible, to give each element its own autonomy, and that it shouldn't be dependent on another. Another thing that I thought was very good was the variables. The variables are of great use, especially when you have a global variable file that may change the design just by changing a few things. And you can use it for colors, for typos, for typography, to have a more consistent design. At the beginning, I didn't know how to name them very well, so I thought that it would be good to call them based on what they are. In this case, for instance, the example is very easy. I'm using a variable that's called blue, and it calls a hexadecimal that is blue. But also the designer says that the design changes a lot, especially with startups. And imagine that icon or logo is no longer blue and the design is orange. So we have to overwrite the hexadecimals for the whole project to be changed. So now we have a blue variable and the hexadecimal is orange, and that's not good. It happened to me that in projects where I worked, I saw a lot of this. One was light blue, and it was actually pink, because the variables were being called what they were. It would be better to use primary color, secondary color, etc. So with the variables, one of the lessons learned is using semantic and meaningful names that is consistent with our projects and with the things that we know that are going to change. That's how we can make the most of variables. So, and talking about semantic groups, although here this little part is HAML, this is the typical HAML to do a structure. These are the typical non-semantic classes, and all of us like to use semantic design classes. This is a very simple grid. For instance, customized classes with more significance. So what happens with this? One of the things that we talk a lot about is using semantic classes and using the SAS extends to call the design part. An extend basically is extending a selector into another. That is, or what was done with CSS to hang from the stylus of an element. So we see SAS like this. It's very short, very clean, and apparently what we are doing makes a lot of sense. The problem of this is that we forget, for instance, that here I mark the element columns. It's an element that will be repeated a lot, because almost all things are columns. So if we extended columns in a number of semantic elements, we would have a huge list of selectors calling the same stylus. And imagine, here I give us a very simple example, but this is just a short list. But imagine in a large website project, this list may increase, and out of experience, let me tell you that it's not good to change things if you have a big list of selectors. And this is something that we wouldn't do with CSS in good practices. So, and it's also a problem that we have with BCSS. They complained that the file was very big, and we are doing it with SAS. Furthermore, there's a browser that doesn't like the electors. To tell you the truth, I don't know, but I know that he doesn't like it. It doesn't work. There's another issue. With the extends, one of the lessons is we check the final output. One way we can do it is, well, if you don't look at the browser, you may have a line you may open the file where CSS are compiled and partial to see how it looks. And now in this example, I made another error with the extents. We have the same example as before, but as you see, I'm extending 2 electors here. And this, SAS doesn't understand it. It's not that it's going to put the class and underneath the styles or the rules. SAS understands it this way. Puts this and puts these separate in different lists of selectors. This could also be a list. And that's not good, because sometimes maybe you have to change something of that element, of that class, and you have to go and look for it in different parts. It's all separated. So, just in case, try to use only one extend for each selector. That is, using just only one is okay. And in the other one, the results that we get is very strange. Another technique that can be used is maybe using placeholders instead of selectors. So, for instance, we have the same example as before. Instead of using classes, we're going to use placeholder. That is a selector that is mute, so as to speak. Unless we extend it, it won't have any CSS outputs. As here in the case of columns, we call for columns, and it won't have any CSS output unless we do the extend. Now what happens with this? It's exactly the same problem as with extend, with the only difference that columns won't be in this list. So maybe, thinking that it's a placeholder, we use it a lot, as if it were an extend, and then we don't realize that actually it has the same rules. So the placeholder, in my view, is useful for other things. Maybe not for things as serious as a grid. For instance, for small stylus or pieces of stylus that I want to repeat in the file, such as the edges or the background color, that don't have so much to do with the structure but with visual design. Here, for instance, we can see that we extend. If we use a little bit judiciously, the placeholder is a good feature. So it's for small pieces of stylo. It's not for a complete grid, for instance. Another tool that SAS gives us are the MIXINS. Well used and with proper functions and things like that, more complex, they're very good. They give you back things. They solve a lot of EY problems. But here we have the same grid. And instead of using extend, we are going to use MIXINS. I know that with the other syntaxes, by add you put include and the name of the MIXIN. These MIXINs are going to be in different partials. We're going to call them. We'll give them arguments precisely for the element that we want to use. In this case, we're going to call the grids and the rows and the columns. So the output it has is this one. It looks even prettier. It has CSS. It no longer has the commas or the list of selectors. It looks much better. Now, this is used unless you use a number of semantic uses. MIXIN is a compact way of seeing a chunk of CSS. Here you code with more MIXINs, and the result of that CSS will be much larger. And if you use the MIXIN because it appears as a line in all your selectors and you don't see the CSS, you don't notice that in the long term you are blowing the CSS with other things, with the stylos that are repeated. So you have to be careful about the MIXINs. Basically, what I can say about the MIXINs is that we should use them with a certain criterion and in combination with other things such as functions in SASS, they are quite helpful. Let me tell you more or less how I structure a project. Mostly, I always try to prioritize not just the visual things and design, but also performance, because the site goes very slowly, and that cannot be good. I separate by partials the option that you can do imports with one single request of HTTP, and that's very good because you can structure your project well. I separate them in modules, partials, and vendor. In modules, what I put is everything that doesn't generate an CSS, for instance, the mixins, the variables, patterns that I put together with the placeholders. Unless I call them or extend them, nothing happens. They stay there. Then in partials, I put things, more concrete things, UI elements that I'm going to use and things like that. In partials, I have, let me give you a piece of advice that I use a lot. Maybe instead of, I have a file with the global variables, and I have it for all the project. But in the mixins or in some partials, there are local variables. So if I have to use that mixin in some other project, I take the file and I move it, I shift it from one place to the other. Now, everything that is outsourced CSS would go in vendor. If we do foundation, bootstrapping, grids, and all this will be compiled in the main SASS, and main SASS later in CSS. So for me, SASS is glamorous, it's very good, but it will not bring the architecture to your project. That is, if you have poor habits with CSS, it's very likely that unless you think of the future architecture of the CSS or SASS in your project, it's not that SASS with its features will come and fix all your problems. So what I recommend is that you have to choose a technique that will give you, in the end, the best outlook, and that may keep your CSS predictable, reusable in any project, and that it should be maintainable. So no longer should we be patching the same file. It should be scalable and fabulous.
Este es GitHub, mi Twitter y Dribble.
So this is Noelia. There you have my Twitter. I come from Buenos Aires, where Restaurando is, and we're always looking for people interested in products and development of Ruby. There you have the site. Does anybody have any questions?